Welcome, traveler. You once again begin to emerge out of that void, that cerebral place of darkness, uncertainty, unknown. You find your path just one step at a time, taking a moment to realize in that crash course of emergence that you came from, so many things were told for you. You were told this is a tree. This is the path. This is the sky above us. This is who you are. It made sense, right? Coming out of that different place, that place where I don't know what it is. I don't have real good memories of it. My memories only kick in a few years later when I've been walking that path for just a little bit, right? And so many other things had already been determined, right? So many other things had been becoming these boxes. I'd become in a box. I don't know if that's exactly your experience in it, but it seems like that's the act of becoming, right? Is originally understanding that everything around us is what we've been told and not what we've been told at the same time. That we have our own agency in this and kind of can realize that maybe we're a little bit more than simply just walking a path that we were told to walk on. Maybe no one really has a for sure understanding of where this path is walking to. So we do our best to find companionship along that journey, to try and make sense of what this is and to shoot the shit, right? And talking about what is this? What is this path? Is this dirt? That's a nice bug. I like that bug. But more importantly, we can join in these moments to come together to ask, what the fuck is happening? What have we come through? How did we get here? Those real big, fun existential questions, and they're never easy. That's why we need sometimes that companion to walk through to really be like, hey, what was this? And then when you're able to ask those questions earnestly and take a moment to listen to them earnestly, right? You can be like, oh, maybe I'm not alone in this. Maybe there's some other weird folk walking along this path that has a similar kind of, maybe not 100% the same, but a similar understanding of like, bro, we are here right now, aren't we? And luckily enough today, we're able to be joined by one of those fellow companions. Someone who is not afraid to not simply just run up in front of you or tag along behind you, but is brave enough to take a moment to walk alongside you and take a moment to explain to them what it meant to get to this point in this path, how it took to get there. So, traveler, today we're going to dive right into Jared's descent. And Jared, I'm going to ask you a pretty simple question here after the beginning. What faith did you start with? What was those first kind of macro worldviews of how you understood your place in the world? And what was that world to you?
Well, first and foremost, Tall, as always, thank you so much for having me on the descent into illumination. I love being here. I love being introspective, as you know, and it's quite a challenge to think through these topics, but it's something that I'm brave enough to do with you today. One of my best friends in life.
It's an honor.
I love sharing these details with you, with your audience, and just being able to kind of walk you down the path that I went down. It's an exciting opportunity, and I think it's something that hopefully travelers can learn from in their own way. Everyone's going to have their own path, their own perspective, but I think of this as kind of like a mindset of how you can be introspective in your own life, on your own journey, to really think through what were those moments. And for me, well, where did it begin? I think that is a natural starting point, right? And I started as a non-denominational Christian. That is how I was raised.
Now, as someone, so we both grew up in Abrahamic faiths, right?
Yes.
And so I think we kind of have our first conceptual understandings of the world is kind of being mirrored within that Abrahamic faith. Now, obviously, we have two different interpretations of that Abrahamic faith, so I'd really be interested in understanding if, your earliest memories of kind of what the world is, right? Does it come from a place of, of that religious education, or was it those simple answers that God made the world, or like what was your first kind of, if you take a moment to really take a step back and try to understand like where you think your origin point of where Jared was in the world, what do you think baby Jared's understanding of his place in the world was?
Well, I'll tell you what, some of my first memories, it probably doesn't surprise you, Tall, just given the type of person I am, but some of my first memories that I can recollect on was me having my own existential crisis at like the age of 3 or 4 about, where am I? What is this? All these questions that I didn't even know how to ask yet, but I was still somehow asking it in my mind because I've just always had that curiosity, right? But I would say when I was young in general, let's just say 5 and on, because that's when I could really start to interpret more of these abstract concepts. And my parents started to teach me. It was very informal. I had a very, very informal upbringing with Christianity. It was pretty much that God laid the foundation. All things are here because of God. God created everything. Obviously, you could pray to God if you need help, if you need support, you can lean on him. And that was pretty much the foundation of everything. It felt very it felt very vague, I guess, because it wasn't like we didn't do Bible study. We didn't go to church. We didn't really talk about scripture or anything like that. Like, obviously, I had gotten wind of it over the years. But early on in my Christian journey, it was really just about God. It was a very kind of blanket for everything, right? So if something happened, it's because it was the time for that thing to happen. It was meant to be. God had ordained this to happen. You are here because of God. God has your path laid out for you. And it kind of gives you like a deterministic approach on life. Right? It kind of strips a little bit of your free will because you kind of grow up thinking like, well, God has a plan for me, right? God has a plan for me. God has a plan for everybody. God made everything. Clearly, we're just being puppeteered, right? That's kind of what it felt like growing up. And I do have to say it was rather interesting, especially in the context that like we were spiritual and religious, but not religious as other people were, right? Like we weren't devout Christians where we were really going in and like going to service every Sunday and reading the Bible and things like that. Like my parents had exposure to it previously, but when I was a young child up into my teenager years, it was a very informal upbringing with God.
So I think you touched on something pretty interesting right there, right? This idea that God is everything and everywhere, and kind of this almost not precognition, but predetermination, right? So, I remember having, kind of similar understandings of God, right? Where God is supposed to be this everything, but, I think that, I don't know if this is necessarily given the difference of Judaism between Christianity, but, right, there's a much more adversational approach to God in Judaism, right? Where God isn't this primordial being, while it is both everything and everywhere, but is also this tangible thing in the garden, right? We Jews wrestle with angels, right? In the Bible and everything, right? So it's a much more kind of different, almost adversational relationship at times, right? So I think it's really interesting for me that I almost had like this determination that it is everywhere, but at the same time was kind of like almost this thing to battle and, to go against, right? Do you think that, when you were going through this thing, I think how did you start to determine your place in the world? If God is everything and you have kind of maybe limited actions over what you can do. And if God has this plan, what did that make Jared? What was Jared's place in this?
I mean, a really great question, Tall. I mean, it just, I mean, I'll say that it probably was a very interesting point in my life when I was a child, because obviously I had heard these things about God. I listened, I understood what my parents were saying, but ultimately it didn't faze me that much because I was still a kid. I was still kind of having that happy-go-lucky, like just looking forward to playing with my friends every day, out in front of the house, on the mountaintops, going to school, all that stuff. Like it was something where it was in the back of my mind, of course, but I wasn't really confronting my own mortality, my own predetermined path ahead of me. It was something that was kind of, I felt like I was putting that baggage off into the future. I was like, I'm not going to worry about it right now. I'm just going to do me and I'm going to live me. Because again, God wasn't something that was really, I guess, forced down my throat. It was something that it was part of my upbringing. Yes, it was part of the fabric. Almost thinking like the fabric of space-time itself. It was the fabric that kind of held my family together. And, you know, our foundation was faith-based. But the way we led our lives was not extremely reflective of that. So it did lead to, again, me kind of dismissing it at times and also having some moments of cognitive dissonance. Like, if I really get into my journey when I was a kid, I mean, my parents, they, like I said, they didn't set any example of that formalized religion, and they were going out and living their life, having a good time. We were going on, you know, lots of family trips. My parents would buy me everything that I wanted. Like, I was pretty spoiled as a child. And it kind of just, again, gave me, I guess, just a little bit more of like an entitlement complex when I was a kid, because I just felt like these are expectations that I had of the world, that I just had it all. Like, my parents were great. I had everything I wanted. My friends always wanted to play with me. They liked me. I was the leader of the group, right? When I would play with my friends. And life was just good. It was just, I felt like I was at the top of the world, but supported by God. It didn't feel like at that time in my life that this predetermined existential crisis was really weighing on me. And I would say that it probably wasn't until around the Great Recession and in that time that things really started to shift, not only with our approach to Christianity, especially my parents, but also just my overall mindset. Like, I would say that's when kind of the dark storm clouds started to roll in my life. But if we're talking about pre-recession up through middle school, like early middle school, life was great. It was really, and there's some non-religious stuff I could talk about in that transition that also made things rough for me. But I mean, right now we're covering the part of my life that was really sunshine and roses, to be honest. And there was just that lingering doubt, and obviously that like cognitive dissonance, because sometimes I would ask myself, even when I was a young kid, like, what really is this whole God thing, right? Like, if we're just living our lives like everybody else and people believe different things and we're not adhering to any sort of scripture, like, what is all this, right? Like, it kind of makes you question it a little bit when it's not like, when you're not doing everything by what the Bible says. And of course, I'm a very cerebral person, so that, I think maybe that's the first time that I started to have doubts, is just failing to reconcile this formalized religion that is prescribed to you versus what my family did, which is not subscribing to all those things. It kind of felt like a, I guess, a la carte version of Christianity, if I'm going to put it lightly. It's like, be a good person, believe in God, God created everything, but we don't have to do all that other stuff, right? It just felt like kind of like build your own Christianity, if you will. That was kind of the approach that I grew up with.
No, and so that was kind of more, like you said, a cognitive dissonance for you, right? You know, being able to understand that, like, hey, we don't stone people anymore, right? You know, and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah. I was very just perturbed when I first got wind of stories from the Bible. Like, what, like, what? Like, I was so confused. Like, all these teachings, all the stuff that's in here is not what we're doing today. It's a lot of it's not relevant, and we're not even leading by everything that it says. Like, we're doing things that the Bible says not to do, but these are things that were relevant 2,000 years ago, but not today in the era of modern technology and society, right? So it's like, even the stuff like the commandments, like thou shalt not lie. It's like, well, I've lied before. Does that mean I'm going to hell? It's like you start to have these existential mini crises, if you will. You start to have those, and then your parents reassure you that God is forgiving, God is love, you're fine. But then it also starts to trickle in that doubt where you're like, hey, if God is forgiving and omniscient, then can I ever truly go to hell, right? I think those are maybe some of the first existential crises I had, where it's like, does this even mean anything? Because it's like, I could be a terrible person and still see those pearly gates, right? But then subjectively, other people are going to be banished to hell. Like, what does that mean?
Well, and for as a smaller individual at this time, as a kid, right? What do you think that, like, ultimately, like, you accept? Because for a long time that was your answer, and your answer was yes to those things. Tell me about, like, kind of like that kind of mindset was for you.
Like, how it shifted?
Well, not even then, but like how it even started as being like, like maybe these evil like talk to me about what it was like being in the mindset of like having those existential crises, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking, as this small, as someone who's still trying to figure out their place in the world, right? And still trying to incorporate these terms and knowledge and understanding. What is it like to be thinking like, oh, do all these bad people go to heaven, right? And like, what does that mean for me? Or do like good, or, a lot more, intense approaches will be like, not a lot of people go to heaven, right? Or like, how does that work? These dissidents they were talking about. Mm-hmm. What were those feelings and pressures like?
Well, I will say that my parents did a great job of selling Christianity to me. I will say that first and mm-hmm. foremost, because they always took the soft approach with everything. They would never, like, I know some faiths and some upbringings are very strict about things, especially in like what I've heard with Catholicism and their approach to faith, and that God isn't as forgiving. So that could be a challenge, and it's kind of baked into a lot of people in that faith. But obviously in a non-denominational Christian household, it just kind of felt like, again, we were able to have Christianity fit our lifestyle, what we wanted. And how I looked at it is I would have these moments where I'd have these little mini existential crises, and I'd ask these questions because, of course, I'm curious, like, what happens if someone does something bad? Do they go to hell? What about this? What about that? And how do you get to heaven? What is heaven? What is the afterlife? And stuff that I even got exposed to at a young age, because my Opa, my great-grandfather, passed after really not having known him that much. Like, I had met him a few times that I recollect, and then he passed when I was quite young. Like, I think I was like 7 years old when he passed. And again, the answers I got were always softened responses. It was very much to keep me out of a bad light, right? So it's like, as long as I'm a good person, as long as I'm not doing anything to hurt other people, I'll be fine. Little white lies here and there, God will forgive those. Obviously, getting told that all my family members that are deceased are going to heaven and that they will be there. Because again, I think it's a very egocentric point of view for the family. It's something where, like, of course, we don't want to shine ourselves in a bad light. So we kind of interpret this Christian faith to, like, make ourselves feel more comfortable in our reality. Like, of course, like, if we were to say that, oh, you did this, that means you're going to repent for it, or someone in our family did something bad, so that means they're going to hell. Like, that's not something you want to tell your child. You want to really soften that approach so that they are kind of bred this Christian mindset. So it just felt like every time I had these existential crises and I'd bring up these really good philosophical, thought-provoking questions, I would just really be given, I guess, kind of the rosy-colored lens on that perspective. I'd pretty much be told what I want to hear. And it was also just, I will say this, I am naturally a very non-confrontational person. I don't like confrontation. I don't like confronting people if I don't have to. I don't like to have those moments of discomfort with someone else. Like, it's just something that I naturally am averse to, and I've had to really work on it as an adult to put myself in those situations where I need to stand up for myself more. But at that time, I trusted my parents. I believed everything that they said. I didn't really... I had some doubt, of course, but it wasn't to the point or the extent where I was like, they're lying to me, or they're misled, or they're led astray. It wasn't to that point yet. I was still young, I was impressionable, and I didn't want to have a confrontation. So if they gave me an answer, they prescribed me an answer about how God works and how religion works, I would accept it at face value. I may be left in that conversation with some questions and wheels turning, but honestly, it kind of like what a lot of people go through with mental trauma. I think a lot of those unresolved questions and those anxieties kind of just get suppressed. They just get buried because it's like, okay, well, they gave me this answer. It's not like, it's what I wanted to hear, but it's not what I was looking for, if that makes sense. Like, yeah, that sounds great. That sounds awesome. I'm good. This is how the world works. But it also leaves me feeling like, but why is it that way? Why is it so rosy colored? Like, why do bad things happen to good people? Why does that happen? Oh, it was their time. They were meant to go, Jared. Okay, well, why? Like, why would this, like, higher power just preordain someone's death for some conscious reason? Like, that doesn't seem to make sense. Oh, it's part of his plan. What is his plan? I don't know anything about his plan. Do we know his plan? How do we know? Have we seen God? Can we touch him? Can we interact with him? No. So again, I think that's all those doubts that I had over time that I started to suppress as a child, started to really embed in the fabric of my mind, to the point where I think one day when I became older and I started to get into my teenage years, it really started to weigh on me heavier and heavier, more heavily. And then it just started to really express itself as having even more severe cognitive dissonance when I got older, because I really started to re-examine all those questions that I had in the past and think through, well, that's really fucked up.
Yeah.
So
I think you touched on something that I really want to highlight, and I want you to kind of go a little bit more into. I think you touched about like this mechanism that you had in this way of processing the world that I think is really important to acknowledge, because it's different for everyone. Mm-hmm. You talked about this process of how you defined and shaped the world even when you didn't agree with it. And I think you talked about
Correct.
some of the really important reasons why of it being with your, out of good intentions of your family telling you like how the simple way of, talking about Christianity at times, right? Or just to simplify it in different ways, right?
Yes.
And you talked about this need to accept and please, right? The social pressures that we have in those different moments, right?
Yep.
And how you adopted that into essentially fundamental worldviews,
Yes.
right? If you want to take a moment just to kind of dive a little bit more into that, I think I'd really appreciate that.
Of course. And you touched on a phrase that I was just about to get into myself, is that it was a lot of immense social pressure to get there, and I didn't want to let my parents down. I think that every child has this innate tendency to want to please their parents, and I'll be honest, for most of my life I've been a people pleaser, and I've really tried to work on it, especially in the last 10 years or so, but being more of an advocate for myself. But especially when I was a child, I was a huge people pleaser, especially for my parents. My parents were my world. They truly were my world, and I never wanted to let them down. I never wanted to disappoint them, and I thought, what's wrong with a little faith, right? I can't disprove it in my head. I can't rationalize it. Just accept it. And I made it part of my worldview because it made me feel like I was in lockstep with my parents. It made me feel like I was connected to my community that were also brought up on that faith. It made me feel secure in an odd way, because I felt like, okay, well, if I do believe in this faith and I agree with these people, maybe there is something to it. It's kind of like it's similar to like a cult mentality where it's like if we all agree that this is how the world works, then we're all safe in our own little cocoon. So it gave me that sense of safety, that sense of security. It was the fabric of my world, and ultimately, I think what made it palatable is the fact that I didn't have to necessarily change the way I lived my life. Like, at that stage of my life, I was able to be the Jared that I had always been. I was able to go out and have fun with my friends and goof around and be a little troll at school sometimes and all that stuff, like just be me. But at the end of the day, it just really shaped me in this mindset that, hey, be a good person and everything will work itself out. So I do have to say that the upbringing that I had that was very informal and very much based on the golden rule, it did kind of shape me as the person I am today, of being more of this calm and confident individual, especially emphasis on the calm part, where it's like, hey, there could be a lot of distress happening, but I can go to that place of calmness. And I even get that today. People that I interact with on a daily basis, especially people that aren't like my close friends or family, they're like, wow, you're like really calm and composed in these extremely stressful situations. I'm like, it's just who I am. I have this tendency to still to this day be able to go to that place. And it's not a place today obviously founded in religion, but I think it was more of just a mindset that I cultivated over time because I was given such a rosy colored view on society. And, you know, as I've gotten older, obviously I've realized how fucked up society really is, like exponentially as I got older into my teenage years and then adulthood. But somehow I've still kept that calmness at heart. And it really, so I think that there's a lot of insight there, Tall, that my worldview, even today, was influenced by my upbringing. But even at the time, it went much more than that. It was more than a mindset and a reaction, but it was also like, be good, keep the faith, and you'll get to those pearly gates. I think that was a little bit of that existential dread that I had at the time that was very real and not suppressed, was, hey, I have to do these things on my checklist, even though it wasn't super formalized. Otherwise, I won't go to heaven. And I, like anyone would be, I was concerned with my own mortality, even as a kid, because it's like, when I do die one day, I would, of course, nothing is proven at this point, scientifically speaking, but who doesn't want to carry on their existence in some capacity, whether that be reincarnation, some other dimension, heaven, whatever it is. Like, you would want to keep existing in a different way, but like be free from your current burdens and your current suffering and kind of start anew. So that was also part of this mindset, that it kind of felt like mental gymnastics. It felt like I was the hamster on the wheel, that I just had to keep it fucking turning and turning and turning, because one day that hard work is going to pay off. And that also shaped my worldview too, because it made me, like, who I was at that time was someone that I was eager to turn that hamster wheel. I was eager to work really hard, until I learned later in life that it was actually more beneficial to work smart rather than work hard. But at the time, of course, it was like, keep turning that wheel, and all that hard work, all the blood, sweat, and tears, it will pay off someday, because you will get there.
Now, you talk about these different intrinsic motivations, right? And these things that at that time were being given to you, and that you really felt being starting, like, quite in the hamster wheel case, quite literally turning inside of you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and you talk about, you know, how a lot of these different pressures and everything like to that led to kind of these different breaks from how you view the world. But you also talked about, like, how you had these rosy colored lenses, right? Mm-hmm. And then you were taught that, and how you were able to, even during those different breaks, find what that means to you still, and come back from that place of compassion and that positive outlook on it, right? Mm-hmm. Talk to me about that being implanted in that time period, and like how you think that, like, ultimately you were able to go through this journey, right? And maybe disalign yourself from exactly the Abrahamic teachings and everything like that, but still be able to maintain this love and compassion and this rosy colored glass, right? Because intrinsically you're being taught, like what you were telling, that everything's love, everything's from this place of kindness and everything like that, especially in your relationship with Christianity. That was the kind of Christianity you subscribe to, is Jesus' love, Jesus' kindness and compassion and all these different things, right? Mm-hmm. So you can see these different elements that you were able to hold on to, right, that you were taught at that time period, and ultimately use as a strength and part of your identity. But at the same time, take a big step away from a lot of the other stuff that was attached to that, right? So what was